Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are watching, and please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Picture this. A 13-year-old boy stands in a sunlit courtyard in northern Greece, surrounded by gardens that will become his classroom for the next 3 years. His father, the most powerful king in the Greek world, has just introduced him to a middle-aged philosopher with small, penetrating eyes and a slight lisp. The boy is Alexander, destined to conquer an empire stretching from Greece to India. The philosopher is Aristotle, who will conquer something far more enduring. He will map the territory of human excellence itself. Aristotle leans forward and asks the young prince a question that will echo through 23 centuries to reach us tonight. What does it mean to live well? Not how to conquer kingdoms, not how to accumulate wealth or fame or power, but something more fundamental, more urgent, more intimately relevant to each of us preparing for sleep on this quiet evening. What does it mean for a human being to flourish? What is the good life? Tonight, as the world settles into darkness and your breathing slows, we will follow Aristotle's answer to this question. We will trace his path from the dusty academies of ancient Athens to his private conversations with history's greatest conqueror. We will discover why this question still matters, why Aristotle's response speaks to our modern anxieties perhaps more powerfully than it did to his contemporaries, and why the ancient Greek word Eudaimonia contains a vision of happiness that our culture has largely forgotten. This is not a lecture. Think of it as an evening walk through one of the most beautiful minds in human history, a mind that believed human excellence was not only possible but achievable, that understood virtue as a practical skill we could develop through practice, that saw happiness not as a fleeting emotion, but as a way of being in the world. As you settle deeper into comfort, let Aristotle's measured reasoning guide you. His logic has a way of being unexpectedly captivating, building understanding slowly, stone by careful stone, until suddenly you see the complete architecture of a life well lived. Fair warning, you may find yourself wide awake at the end, mind illuminated by ideas that have guided humanity's greatest achievements. But even if sleep claims you early, these thoughts will settle into your rest like seeds in fertile soil, quietly working their transformation while you dream. So breathe deeply, let the tensions of your day release, and allow yourself to wonder, as that young prince wondered in a garden 2 millennia ago, what would it mean for me to truly flourish? The ancient Greeks had no word for religion as we understand it. They had no word for science as a separate discipline. They had no division between mind and body, no split between reason and emotion, no separation of private ethics from public politics. What they had was philosophy, literally the love of wisdom, and it encompassed everything. To study philosophy in ancient Athens was to ask the most practical question imaginable. How should I live? Into this world, in the year 384 before the Common Era, a boy was born in the small coastal city of Stagira on the Macedonian frontier. His name was Aristotle. His father, Nicomachean, served as court physician to King Amyntas of Macedon, and from his earliest years Aristotle was exposed to the careful observation, the empirical attention to detail that characterized medical practice. While other children learned through myths and stories, young Aristotle watched his father examine symptoms, make diagnoses, test remedies. The lesson would shape everything that followed. Look first at what actually is before theorizing about what might be. Tragedy struck early. Nicomachean died when Aristotle was still a boy, perhaps 10 years old. The young philosopher-to-be was sent to live with a guardian, Proxenus, who recognized something remarkable in his charge's hungry intellect. At 17, Aristotle was dispatched on the long journey to Athens, to the greatest center of learning the world had ever known, Plato's academy. Imagine the journey. A young man from the provinces carrying whatever scrolls and tablets a traveling student could manage, walking the dusty road southward, past villages and olive groves, over mountain passes where bandits lurked, through landscapes sacred to gods whose temples crowned every prominent hill. And then, finally, Athens herself. The city of Pericles and Socrates, still glorious despite recent defeats in war, her white marble temples catching the Mediterranean sun, her agora buzzing with merchants and philosophers, her theatre where Sophocles had premiered his tragedies, her law courts where citizens argued about justice and the good. The academy stood outside the city walls, in a grove sacred to the hero Academus. Here Plato, already in his 60s, taught a remarkable collection of students how to think. Not what to think, but how, through dialogue and debate, through mathematical precision and logical rigour, through the relentless questioning that his teacher Socrates had pioneered. The method was simple and devastating. Take any claim about reality, any assumption about justice or beauty or truth, and ask, what do you mean by that? How do you know? Could it be otherwise? Question after question after question until either the claim stood on solid foundation or collapsed into incoherence. Aristotle arrived at this intellectual crucible at precisely the right moment. His mind was formed enough to engage seriously with Plato's ideas, but flexible enough to be shaped by them. And for the next 20 years, he remained, studying and eventually teaching, absorbing Plato's vision while slowly developing his own. What was that vision? Plato believed that the world we experience through our senses, this world of stones and trees and flesh, is not fully real. Behind it, or above it, or somehow beyond it, exists a realm of perfect forms. The triangle you draw on paper is always imperfect, but there exists the form of triangle, perfect and eternal. The beautiful person you see is beautiful only by participating in the form of beauty itself. Justice in our world is always approximate, but justice itself exists in this transcendent realm, perfect and unchanging. It was a breathtaking vision, answering profound questions about how knowledge is possible and why we recognize universal concepts despite experiencing only particular instances. But Aristotle found himself increasingly troubled by it. If these forms exist separately from the world of experience, how exactly do particular things participate in them? How does the form of horse make this particular horse here and now? The explanation seemed to push the mystery back one step without really solving it. More fundamentally, Aristotle couldn't shake his physician father's influence. Look at the world, his training insisted. Study what actually exists. The answers aren't in some transcendent realm, but here, in the structures and patterns of nature itself. Don't flee from particulars to universals, but find the universal within the particular. Walking through the academy's gardens, past the stone colonnades where students debated, beneath olive trees that dappled the sunlight, Aristotle began formulating an alternative. Yes, we need universal concepts to understand reality. Yes, we recognize patterns that transcend individual instances. But perhaps these universals exist in things themselves, not in some separate realm. Perhaps the form of a horse is what makes this particular arrangement of matter a horse rather than a tree. Form and matter together constitute reality, inseparable, interdependent. The disagreement was profound, but never acrimonious. In later writings, Aristotle would criticize his teacher's theory of forms, but always with respect, always acknowledging Plato's brilliance. Plato is dear to me, but truth is dearer. This saying captures Aristotle's spirit. Loyalty to persons matters, but loyalty to truth matters more. The teacher-student relationship need not become adversarial just because the student thinks the teacher wrong about something fundamental. For 20 years, this was Aristotle's life. Study, debate, teach, think, write. The rhythms of academic existence, the slow accumulation of understanding, the gradual refinement of arguments. He was becoming a master of multiple disciplines, logic and rhetoric, biology and physics, politics and ethics, metaphysics, and poetry. The breadth of his interests was staggering. While his contemporaries specialized, Aristotle ranged across the entire landscape of human knowledge, finding connections, building systems, constructing a unified vision of reality. Then, in 347 BCE, Plato died. The academy passed to Plato's nephew Speusippus, and Aristotle chose to leave. The reasons remain debated. Was it disappointment at not being chosen to lead? Was it time for the student to step out of his master's shadow? Or was it simply that Aristotle's intellectual project required independence? Whatever the reason, Aristotle departed Athens. He travelled first to Asia Minor, to the court of Hermias in Atanius, where he continued his research and married Pythias, Hermias's adopted daughter. He spent time on the island of Lesbos, studying marine biology, wading through tide pools, dissecting sea creatures, observing with the meticulous attention to detail that would characterize all his work. These were years of intellectual wandering, of gathering observations, of letting his systematic approach mature. He studied how baby squids develop inside their eggs. He examined the hearts of different animals, noting structural variations. He watched the migration patterns of birds and wondered what internal mechanism drove them. In all of this, he was developing a method. Observe first, observe carefully, observe repeatedly. Record what you find. Notice patterns. Form hypotheses. Test them. Build explanations from the ground up. This was radically different from the prevailing approach to natural philosophy, which tended towards speculation from first principles. Aristotle was teaching himself to be empirical, to trust experience, to build theory on the foundation of observed fact. The lessons learned watching his father practice medicine were flowering into a comprehensive scientific method. His personal life in these years remains shadowy to us. We know he married Pythias and loved her. We know they had a daughter together. We know that when Pythias died, Aristotle grieved deeply. Later he would form a relationship with Herpyllis, with whom he had a son, Nicomachus. But Aristotle rarely wrote about his private emotions. His work focused outward, on the structures of reality, on the patterns of nature, on the principles of living well. Then, around 343 BCE, an invitation arrived that would change everything. King Philip of Macedon, who was transforming his kingdom into the dominant military power in Greece, wanted a tutor for his 13-year-old son. And he wanted that tutor to be Aristotle. Why? Perhaps because Aristotle's father had served Philip's own father as court physician, creating a family connection. Perhaps because Aristotle, though not yet famous, had already acquired a reputation for brilliance. Perhaps because Philip, in his ambition to unite Greece under Macedonian leadership, wanted his heir educated in the finest Greek traditions. Whatever the reason, the offer came with considerable inducements. Philip promised to rebuild Stagira, Aristotle's home city, which he himself had destroyed in an earlier campaign. The payment would be generous, the position would be prestigious. But most importantly, Aristotle would have the opportunity to shape the mind of a future king, to plant ideas of justice and virtue and excellence in a boy who would wield tremendous power, to perhaps create through education a ruler who would govern wisely and well, for a philosopher who believed that ethics and politics were inseparable, that the good life required a good community. This opportunity must have been irresistible. And so Aristotle journeyed north, back to the Macedonian frontier of his youth, to meet the young prince who would become Alexander the Great. The teaching took place at Mieza, a small village in the verdant countryside outside the Macedonian capital. Here, in or near a temple dedicated to the nymphs, surrounded by forests and streams, Aristotle established what amounted to a private academy for Alexander and a select group of other young Macedonian nobles. Among these students were Hephaestion, who would become Alexander's closest companion, and Ptolemy, who would eventually rule Egypt. The future masters of the Hellenistic world all sat at Aristotle's feet, learning how to think. What did they learn? Not a catechism, but a method. Aristotle taught them to observe carefully, to reason systematically, to question assumptions, to distinguish valid arguments from fallacies. He taught them rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech, and politics, the science of organizing communities. He taught them natural philosophy, examining plants and animals, discussing the principles that govern growth and change. He taught them ethics, exploring questions of courage and justice and the nature of the good life, and crucially, he taught them Homer. Alexander developed an intense love for the Iliad, identifying with Achilles, the warrior hero who chose glory over long life. Some accounts say Alexander carried a copy of the Iliad with him throughout his campaigns, annotated by Aristotle himself, keeping it under his pillow alongside his dagger. The fusion of philosophical training and heroic ambition would have profound consequences. The relationship between teacher and student was complex, mixing genuine affection with fundamental disagreements that would only deepen over time. Aristotle saw himself as forming Alexander's character, instilling virtue, teaching moderation and practical wisdom. But Alexander's nature ran to extremes. He was passionate where Aristotle counselled balance, impetuous where Aristotle advised deliberation, hungry for glory where Aristotle emphasized the contemplative life. They walked together through the countryside around Mieza, the middle-aged philosopher and the adolescent prince, discussing the nature of courage, the different forms of government, the relationship between happiness and virtue. Aristotle must have known even then that his student would achieve great things. What he couldn't have known was how completely those achievements would diverge from his own values. For Aristotle believed in Greek superiority. He viewed non-Greeks, Persians, Egyptians, all the peoples who would fall to Alexander's conquests, as barbarians, natural slaves, suited only to serve their Greek masters. This ugly prejudice was common in classical Greece, born from centuries of conflict with Persia, reinforced by cultural chauvinism. When Aristotle advised Alexander on politics, he apparently suggested treating Greeks as free citizens and barbarians, as subjects to be ruled despotically. Alexander would ultimately reject this advice. His great vision, perhaps his greatest, was of a multicultural empire where Greeks and Persians could intermarry, where talent mattered more than ethnicity, where civilization could transcend its Greek origins. In this, the student proved wiser than the teacher. But that lay in the future. For 3 years the education continued. Philosophy in the morning, physical training in the afternoon, discussions of metaphysics and dissections of animals, poetry and mathematics, the young nobles learning not just information but how to think, how to argue, how to analyze. Aristotle was forming minds, planting seeds that would bear fruit in ways he couldn't anticipate. Then, in 340 BCE, Philip summoned his son home. At 16, Alexander would serve as regent while his father campaigned in Thrace. The formal education was over. Teacher and student would never again spend extended time together, though they continued corresponding. Alexander sent back specimens and observations from his conquests, plants and animals unknown to Greek science, reports of distant lands, puzzles for his old teacher to study. But the intellectual relationship was ending, and philosophical differences were hardening into ideological opposition. When Alexander began integrating Persians into his administration, adopting Persian customs, even demanding prostration from Greek visitors, Aristotle was appalled. This violated everything he believed about Greek superiority and proper political order. The student had moved beyond the teacher's wisdom, making his own path through history. There is a poignant tragedy here. Aristotle had tried to form Alexander's character according to philosophical principles, to create a king who would embody virtue and govern with practical wisdom. But character, as Aristotle himself taught, comes from habituation, from repeated practice, from the slow shaping of desires and responses. 3 years of philosophical instruction couldn't overcome Alexander's fundamental nature. Brilliant, passionate, ambitious beyond measure, unable to recognize limits, the greatest philosopher of antiquity and the greatest conqueror of antiquity touched each other's lives profoundly. Each would achieve immortality in his own sphere, but they remained, in the end, fundamentally different kinds of men. One conquered through thought, the other through the sword. One believed in moderation and the contemplative life, the other in glory and endless achievement. One stayed mostly in Athens, thinking and writing. The other marched to the edges of the known world, never content, never stopping. When Alexander departed for his Asian campaigns in 335 BCE, Aristotle was 50 years old. He returned to Athens, to the city of his intellectual formation, ready at last to establish his own school, to develop his own systematic philosophy, to offer his answer to the question he had posed to young Alexander so many years before. What does it mean to live well? Athens in 335 BCE had changed since Aristotle first arrived as a 17-year-old student. Philip's victory at Chaeronea had ended the era of independent Greek city-states. The Macedonian king now dominated Greece, and after Philip's assassination, his son Alexander ruled. For Athenians who treasured their democratic traditions, this new reality was bitter. They lived under the shadow of Macedonian power. technically independent, but actually subject. Into this politically complex situation, Aristotle returned. His connections to the Macedonian court made some Athenians suspicious, but his reputation as a philosopher, his years at the academy, and his undeniable brilliance earned him respect. He established his school in the Lyceum, a gymnasium dedicated to Apollo Lysias, located just outside the city walls. The Lyceum became Aristotle's base for the next 12 years, the period of his greatest productivity. Here he developed the systematic philosophy that would influence human thought for 2 millennia. Here he gathered around him the brightest students Athens could offer, and here he perfected his distinctive method of teaching. Unlike Plato's academy, which focused on mathematics and abstract reasoning, the Lyceum was organized around empirical research. Aristotle collected specimens, plants, animals, minerals. He gathered maps and documents. He compiled observations sent by correspondents throughout the Greek world, including, remarkably, from Alexander's campaigns. The Lyceum was part school, part research institute, part museum. It was the first institution of its kind, and it set a pattern that universities would follow for centuries. The physical layout encouraged Aristotle's teaching style. The Lyceum had a covered walkway called a peripatos, where Aristotle liked to walk while lecturing. This habit gave his school its name, the Peripatetics, the walkers. Picture him there, in his 50s now, walking slowly along the colonnade, a small group of advanced students following, discussing the nature of causation or the structure of logical argument or the relationship between soul and body. His lectures came in 2 types. In the morning, he offered esoteric teachings for advanced students, dense technical discussions requiring philosophical background. These were the lectures that would eventually be compiled into the treatises we possess: the Physics, the Metaphysics, the Nicomachean Ethics. In the afternoon, he gave public lectures on more accessible topics: rhetoric, politics, ethics. These were polished presentations, carefully crafted for general audiences. The evenings he spent writing, organizing his thoughts, revising his treatises. By lamplight in his study, scrolls spread around him. Aristotle worked to systematize human knowledge. He was attempting something unprecedented, a comprehensive account of reality, from the principles of logic that govern all reasoning, through the structures of the natural world, to the best way for human beings to live. His method was distinctive. Where Plato had begun with ideal forms and tried to explain how particulars participate in them, Aristotle began with the world of experience and tried to understand its inherent structures. Look first, theorize second. Observe the patterns in nature, then explain what makes those patterns possible. This empirical orientation appeared in all his work. His biological writings describe hundreds of animal species with careful attention to anatomy and behavior. His meteorology examines weather patterns, winds, rain, thunder. His politics analyzes 158 different constitutions of Greek city-states, comparing their structures and outcomes. Even his ethics, as we will see, begins with observed facts about human nature and behavior rather than abstract principles. But Aristotle was no mere compiler of facts. What made him revolutionary was his ability to organize observations into systematic understanding. He developed logic as a formal discipline, creating tools for rigorous reasoning. He pioneered the study of causation, distinguishing 4 different ways we can answer why questions. He analyzed motion, change, time, place, infinity. He investigated language, categorizing different types of statements and studying how meaning works. And running through all of this was a deep conviction that the universe makes sense. Reality is not chaos but cosmos, not random but ordered. Natural things have purposes, built-in tendencies, characteristic activities. Understanding something means grasping its nature, its function, what it's meant to be and do. This teleological vision, the idea that things have inherent purposes, would remain influential until the scientific revolution 2,000 years later. Yet despite this comprehensive intellectual productivity, Aristotle's time at the Lyceum was politically precarious. He was a metic, a resident alien, without citizenship rights. He depended on the tolerance of a city that had reasons to distrust him. When Alexander died suddenly in 323 BCE, everything changed. The death of the conqueror unleashed a wave of anti-Macedonian sentiment across Greece. Athens erupted in rebellion, and Aristotle, known to have been Alexander's tutor, connected to the Macedonian court, suddenly found himself in danger. Charges of impiety were brought against him, the same charges that had led to Socrates' execution 76 years earlier. Aristotle was 62 years old, at the height of his intellectual powers. He had spent 12 years building the Lyceum into one of the ancient world's great centres of learning. His systematic philosophy was substantially complete, but the political situation was untenable. Rather than stand trial, Aristotle chose to leave Athens. He reportedly said he would not let the city sin twice against philosophy, a reference to Socrates' fate. He retired to Chalcis on the island of Euboea, where his mother's family had property. And there, less than a year after leaving Athens, he died of a stomach illness. It was 322 BCE. The greatest systematic philosopher in history was gone, leaving behind an intellectual legacy that would shape Western thought for 2,000 years. But we've spent long enough on biography. We know the man, the context, the journey. Now we must turn to what matters most, his ideas. Specifically, his answer to the question that launched our evening together, the question he posed to young Alexander in that sunlit garden at Mieza. What does it mean to live well? What is the good life for human beings? What should we aim at? These questions drive Aristotle's ethical philosophy, and to understand his answers, we must begin with a single word that captures his vision of human flourishing, eudaimonia. The word sounds strange to modern ears. Eudaimonia. It's usually translated as happiness, but this translation misleads almost as much as it clarifies. When we think of happiness, we typically imagine a feeling, an emotional state, something that comes over us when things go well. I feel happy when I eat delicious food, or succeed at a difficult task, or spend time with people I love. Happiness, in our common usage, is something that happens to us, a pleasant sensation we experience. But this is not what Aristotle means by eudaimonia at all. The word itself gives us a hint. It combines eu, meaning good or well, with daimon, meaning spirit or divinity. Literally, eudaimonia means something like having a good spirit, being well-spirited, having your inner nature in good condition. It suggests not a temporary feeling, but a state of being, not an episode, but a way of existing. Perhaps the best translation is flourishing, or living well, or faring well. Think of a plant. What does it mean for an oak tree to flourish? Not that it feels happy, plants don't have feelings, but that it's achieving what it's meant to achieve, developing according to its nature, becoming an excellent specimen of oak tree. It has good soil, adequate water, proper sunlight. Its roots run deep, its trunk grows strong, its branches spread wide, its leaves are full and green. The acorns it produces are healthy. This is oak tree eudaimonia, being a thriving, excellent oak. Now ask the parallel question. What does it mean for a human being to flourish? What is human eudaimonia? This is Aristotle's central question, and answering it requires understanding human nature itself. But before we get to Aristotle's answer, we need to understand why he thinks this question matters so much. Here's where his thinking becomes both elegant and persuasive. Every action we take aims at some good, Aristotle observes. When you eat, you aim at satisfying hunger or maintaining health or enjoying flavour. When you work, you aim at earning money or accomplishing something or serving others. When you exercise, you aim at fitness or stress relief or the pleasure of physical exertion. All human action is goal-directed. Notice what follows from this. Some goods are sought for the sake of other goods. We earn money to buy things. We buy things to satisfy needs or wants. We satisfy needs to maintain life. We maintain life to what? Eventually we must reach some final good, something we want for its own sake, not as means to something else. Otherwise we're caught in an infinite regress, each goal pursued for the sake of another, never reaching any ultimate purpose. What is this final good? What do we want for its own sake? Aristotle thinks the answer is obvious. Eudaimonia. Everyone, he says, pursues happiness or flourishing. It's what we ultimately aim at in all our activities. We want other things for the sake of happiness, but we don't want happiness for the sake of anything else. Happiness is self-sufficient. Having it, we lack nothing essential. Consider what this means. Honor? Yes, we value honor, but why? Because being honored makes us happy. Pleasure? Yes, we enjoy pleasure, but why do we seek it? Because it contributes to happiness. Wealth? Certainly useful, but obviously not the ultimate good. We want wealth to secure happiness, not happiness to secure wealth. Even virtue, and this is crucial, we value ultimately because virtuous living leads to flourishing. So eudaimonia stands at the top of the hierarchy of goods. It's what everything else aims toward. It's the bull's eye on the target, the destination of all our striving. Get clear about what eudaimonia really is, and you've answered the most important question about how to live. But here's where things get interesting. People agree that eudaimonia is the ultimate good, Aristotle notes, but they disagree profoundly about what eudaimonia actually is. Ask different people what happiness consists in, and you'll get radically different answers. The common people, identify happiness with pleasure. A happy life is a pleasant life, full of good food, drink, sex, comfortable circumstances, agreeable company. This view has intuitive appeal. Who doesn't enjoy pleasure? And misery certainly doesn't seem like flourishing. But Aristotle thinks this view fundamentally mistakes what happiness is. Why? Because pleasure is something we share with animals. A dog experiences pleasure when eating or playing. A pig experiences pleasure in its own way. But surely human flourishing must involve something distinctively human. Moreover, the pursuit of pleasure leads to a slavish life, Aristotle argues, where we're controlled by our appetites, always, chasing the next sensation, never satisfied. The hedonist mistakes a component of happiness for happiness itself. What about the sophisticated, politically ambitious people? They often identify happiness with honor, with being respected and admired, with achieving status. This view seems more elevated than hedonism. Honor recognizes something about character or accomplishment. But Aristotle rejects this view too. Why? Because honor depends on other people. They can bestow it or withdraw it. Your happiness can't depend on something so external to you, so vulnerable to others' opinions. Moreover, we pursue honor because we believe we deserve it, because we've achieved something excellent. So the excellence matters more than the honor that might follow from it. Again, the mistake is identifying a byproduct of flourishing with flourishing itself. What about wealth? Some people devote their lives to accumulating money and possessions, but Aristotle barely pauses to refute this view. Wealth is obviously instrumental, obviously pursued for the sake of something else. The miser who hoards wealth without using it for any purpose hasn't achieved happiness. Wealth is like a tool, valuable for what it enables, worthless as an end in itself. So if happiness isn't pleasure or honor or wealth, what is it? Aristotle's answer emerges from his distinctive method, examining the function of human beings. Here's the reasoning. Everything has a characteristic activity, a function, something it does that makes it the kind of thing it is. The function of the eye is to see. A good eye sees well, a bad eye sees poorly. The function of a knife is to cut. A good knife cuts cleanly and holds its edge. For any tool or organ or creature with a function, excellence consists in performing that function well. Does a human being have a function? Not in the sense of being a tool for some external purpose, but in the sense of having a characteristic activity, something that defines what we distinctively are. Aristotle thinks yes. What is our function? It can't be merely living, growing, and maintaining ourselves. We share that with plants. It can't be sensing and responding to our environment. We share that with all animals. The distinctive human function must involve our unique capacity, reason. This doesn't mean our function is to sit around thinking all day, disconnected from the world. Reason permeates all distinctively human activities. When we deliberate about what to do, we're exercising reason. When we form friendships based on mutual respect rather than mere pleasure or utility, reason guides those relationships. When we appreciate beauty, when we understand truth, when we act courageously in the face of fear, when we judge fairly between competing claims, we're exercising rational capacities that animals lack. Human flourishing, then, consists in exercising these rational capacities excellently. It's not passive but active, not a state we fall into, but an activity we perform. not something that happens to us, but something we do. Aristotle's famous formulation, Eudaimonia is activity of soul in accordance with virtue. Let that sink in for a moment. Happiness is activity, not feeling but doing, not possessing but acting. The happy person isn't someone who has achieved a comfortable state and now simply maintains it. The happy person is actively engaged in excellent activity. Flourishing is a verb, not a noun, and this activity must be excellent in accordance with virtue. Here we need to understand what Aristotle means by virtue, a topic we'll explore thoroughly. For now, note simply that virtue means excellence of character and intellect, the qualities that enable us to perform our function well. Just as a good knife has the virtues of sharpness and durability, a good human has virtues like courage, wisdom, justice, and temperance. One more crucial qualification, eudaimonia requires a complete life. One swallow doesn't make a spring, Aristotle says, and one day or brief period doesn't make someone happy. Flourishing is assessed over a lifetime. The young can't yet be called happy because their lives remain unfinished. Only from the perspective of a complete life can we judge whether someone achieved eudaimonia. So, here's Aristotle's answer to his own question, the answer that took him decades to develop, that emerged from observing human nature, analysing human action, studying political communities, thinking carefully about what makes human life distinctively human. To flourish, to achieve eudaimonia, to live well, engage in excellent rational activity over a complete life, in accordance with virtue, with adequate external goods to support that activity. Each element matters. Activity, not passive enjoyment. Rational activity, using our distinctive human capacity. Excellent activity, performing it well. In accordance with virtue, the settled dispositions that enable excellence. Over a complete life, not just moments or episodes. With adequate external goods, acknowledging we need certain material conditions. This is what the greatest philosopher in antiquity concluded about how we should live. Not a simple formula, but a rich, nuanced vision of human flourishing. Not telling us to pursue pleasure or honour or wealth, but inviting us to develop excellence of character and intellect, to exercise our distinctively human capacities at their highest level, to make our whole lives expressions of rationality at its best. But this answer immediately raises questions. What are these virtues that enable excellent activity? How do we develop them? Can anyone become virtuous, or only some? What role does luck play, those external goods Aristotle mentions? And most practically, how do I actually live this way? The rest of our evening together explores these questions. We turn now from Aristotle's destination, eudaimonia, to his map of how to get there, and that map begins with a revolutionary idea about the nature of excellence itself. If you've ever tried to improve yourself, you know the frustration. You want to be more patient, but find yourself snapping at small annoyances. You want to be generous, but hesitate when opportunities arise. You know intellectually what the right thing to do is, yet doing it feels unnatural, forced, exhausting. Virtue seems to require constant effort against your inclinations. Aristotle understood this struggle, and his answer to it forms one of the most psychologically sophisticated parts of his philosophy. Virtue, he argued, is not knowledge alone. You can't become courageous simply by understanding what courage is. You can't become just by studying the theory of justice. Virtue is not information in your head, but disposition in your character. The Greek word Aristotle uses is arete, usually translated as virtue or excellence. But notice what the word captures. Not moral goodness as we typically conceive it, but a kind of excellence, a way of being that realizes potential, achieves what something is capable of. The arete of a racehorse is speed and endurance. The arete of a sword is sharpness and strength. What is the arete of a human being? For Aristotle, virtue is a hexis, a stable state or disposition of character. It's not a fleeting decision, but a relatively permanent way of being. The virtuous person doesn't simply perform virtuous acts occasionally through gritted teeth. Rather, they've developed a settled way of responding to situations such that virtuous action flows naturally from who they've become. But how do you develop such dispositions? Here Aristotle makes his most revolutionary claim, one that contradicted his teacher Plato fundamentally. Plato had argued that virtue is knowledge. If you truly know what's good, you'll do it. Vice is just ignorance. Education, then, is the key to virtue. Aristotle disagreed. Virtue requires knowledge, yes, but knowledge isn't sufficient. You also need proper habituation, repeated practice, the formation of emotional responses and action patterns through experience. In the famous formulation, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, courageous by doing courageous acts. Think of learning to play an instrument. You can study music theory, understand harmony and rhythm intellectually, but that won't make you a pianist. You must practice, repeating scales and exercises until your fingers move correctly without conscious thought, until the patterns become second nature. Only through habit does knowledge become skill. The same applies to virtue. You must practice acting virtuously until virtuous responses become habitual, until you spontaneously respond with courage to danger, with generosity to need, with justice to competing claims. Eventually, these responses feel natural rather than forced. This is when you've truly become virtuous. But practice according to what pattern? What makes an act courageous rather than cowardly or reckless? What distinguishes generous, giving from wasteful excess, or stingy withholding? Aristotle's answer: virtue is a mean between extremes. This doctrine of the mean, sometimes called the golden mean, represents Aristotle's most distinctive contribution to ethics. Every virtue, he argues, lies between two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. Think of it as a spectrum with virtue in the middle, though not at the exact mathematical centre. Take courage, the paradigm virtue in Greek culture. What is courage? Not absence of fear. That would be insensibility or foolhardiness. The coward feels appropriate fear but is paralysed by it, unable to act when action is needed. The reckless person either feels no fear or ignores reasonable danger, rushing into situations that call for caution. Courage lies between these extremes, feeling fear appropriately, but acting despite it when the situation demands. The courageous person stands their ground in battle when standing is necessary for a just cause. They speak truth to power when silence would be cowardice. They admit mistakes when pride tempts them to double down, but they don't seek danger for its own sake. They don't take foolish risks to prove their bravery. They recognize when retreat is wise, when compromise is appropriate, when holding firm would be stubbornness rather than courage. Or consider temperance, the virtue concerning bodily pleasures. On one extreme sits the ascetic who denies all pleasure, treats the body as enemy, lives in miserable self-deprivation. On the other extreme sits the glutton or libertine, enslaved to every appetite, incapable of saying no to desire, life organized around the next indulgence. Temperance lies between, enjoying pleasures appropriately, neither denying them entirely, nor being ruled by them. The temperate person eats delicious food with pleasure, but stops when satisfied. They enjoy wine without becoming drunk. They engage in sexual activity within appropriate relationships. They find entertainment refreshing without becoming addicted to constant stimulation. Their pleasures enhance life rather than dominating it. Generosity provides another example. The stingy person hoards resources, gives nothing or gives only reluctantly, values possessions over relationships. They're incapable of sharing, trapped in scarcity mentality, even when they have plenty. On the opposite extreme, the wasteful person gives indiscriminately, spends recklessly, depletes resources that should be conserved. They might enjoy a reputation for generosity, but ultimately can't sustain it. True generosity lies between these, giving appropriately to the right people, at the right time, in the right way, for the right reasons. The generous person gives freely because they recognize resources as means to good ends, not ends in themselves. But they give thoughtfully, considering whether their giving truly helps. They balance present generosity with future capacity. They give neither too much nor too little, but what the situation requires. Each virtue follows this pattern. Patience lies between apathy, caring about nothing, and explosive anger, losing control over trivialities. The patient person feels anger at genuine injustice, but remains calm in the face of minor annoyances. They know when anger is appropriate and when it's destructive. Truthfulness lies between self-deprecation, underselling yourself, and boastfulness, inflating your accomplishments. The truthful person represents themselves accurately, neither falsely modest nor arrogantly exaggerating. Even wit is a virtue for Aristotle. The boorish person has no sense of humour, can't appreciate jokes, makes social situations uncomfortable with their heavy seriousness. The buffoon jokes constantly, unable to be serious when situations demand it, offends others with inappropriate humour. Wittiness lies between having a sense of humour, knowing when levity is appropriate, making others comfortable without descending into mockery or constant joking. Aristotle identifies many virtues, each with its characteristic pattern of mean between extremes. But several things about this doctrine need emphasis. First, the mean is not mathematical. Virtue doesn't lie at the exact midpoint between extremes. Rather, it's relative to the person and circumstances. The amount of food that's moderate for an athlete differs from what's moderate for a sedentary person. The degree of fear that's appropriate facing a mugger differs from what's appropriate facing a bear. Context matters. Second, finding the mean requires judgment. There's no formula you can simply apply. You must understand the situation, consider what's at stake, recognize relevant factors, then determine what response hits the mean. This judgment, practical wisdom or phronesis, we'll explore more deeply. For now, note that virtue requires intelligence, not just good intentions. Third, not every action or emotion has a virtuous mean. Some things are inherently wrong regardless of amount. Murder isn't excessive killing with moderate killing as virtue. Adultery isn't excessive love. Theft isn't excessive taking. Some acts violate virtue by their very nature. Fourth, the mean is difficult to achieve. The extremes are easier. It's relatively simple to never give anything, stinginess, or to give everything away, wastefulness. Finding the generous mean requires sensitivity to circumstances, understanding of consequences, practical wisdom about what's truly helpful. This is why virtue is rare, and why becoming virtuous requires sustained effort. Finally, and most importantly, the doctrine of the mean reveals something profound about human psychology. Most vices aren't entirely evil impulses we must suppress. Rather, they're good impulses taken too far or not far enough. Fear is appropriate, sometimes. Anger has its place, occasionally. Even the desire for pleasure isn't wrong within limits. This means the path to virtue isn't destroying natural responses, but properly ordering them. Not eliminating fear, but feeling it appropriately. Not suppressing anger, but expressing it rightly. Not denying pleasure, but enjoying it well. Virtue cultivates nature rather than fighting it. Develops our capacities rather than destroying them. Achieves harmony rather than conflict within the soul. Think about what this means practically. You're trying to become more patient. The Aristotelian approach isn't to suppress all irritation, to pretend nothing bothers you, to become some sort of unfeeling automaton. Rather, it's to develop the ability to distinguish genuine wrongs, deserving anger, from minor inconveniences deserving forbearance, to feel proportionate responses to situations, to recognize when your irritation serves no good purpose and let it go, or you're trying to be more confident without becoming arrogant. The Aristotelian approach isn't to split the difference mathematically between self-hatred and narcissism. It's to develop an accurate understanding of your genuine abilities, to present yourself truthfully, to claim credit you deserve without exaggerating, to acknowledge limitations without false modesty. It's complex, nuanced, requiring self-knowledge and situational awareness. This is why virtue takes time. You can't just decide to be virtuous and have it done. You must practice repeatedly in various situations, gradually developing the sensitivity and judgment that enables hitting the mean reliably. Like any skill, it improves with experience and deteriorates without practice. But the doctrine of the mean, elegant as it is, raises a crucial question. How do you develop the judgment to find the mean? How do you know what courage requires in this particular situation? How do you determine where generosity lies between stinginess and wastefulness right now with this person? Aristotle's answer: practical wisdom, phronesis, the intellectual virtue that enables all the moral virtues. If virtue is the destination, practical wisdom is the compass. Without it, even the best intentions lead astray. You might want to be generous but give in ways that harm rather than help. You might aim at courage but misjudge what the situation demands. You might pursue the mean but lack the perception to find it. Practical wisdom is hard to define precisely because it's fundamentally practical rather than theoretical. It's not knowledge of universal principles that can be stated in abstract formulas. It's the ability to see what's required in particular situations, to recognize what action would hit the mean, to understand how general principles apply in specific contexts. Think of an expert chef. They know recipes, understand cooking techniques, can explain why certain ingredients work together. But their expertise goes beyond this theoretical knowledge. When actually cooking, they adjust by taste, compensate for ingredient variations, improvise when something goes wrong. They see what the dish needs, right now, not just what recipes generally recommend. This is practical wisdom applied to cooking. Or consider a skilled therapist. They understand psychological theory, know research about what treatments work. But with any particular client, they must perceive that person's specific needs, recognize what approach will help them, adjust strategies when initial attempts don't work. They exercise judgment that goes beyond applying rules, wisdom that emerges from experience with particulars. Practical wisdom works similarly in ethics. The person with phronesis perceives what situations truly demand. They see that this apparent conflict between friendship and honesty actually requires tactful truth-telling. They recognize that this request for help, though sincere, would enable destructive behavior. They understand that standing firm here would be courage, but standing firm there would be stubbornness. How do they see these things? Through experience, primarily. Practical wisdom develops over time as you face various situations. Try different responses, observe consequences, learn from mistakes. You can't acquire it from books alone, any more than you can become a chef or therapist purely through reading. You must practice repeatedly in the messiness of actual circumstances. But experience alone isn't sufficient. You need to experience situations with the right orientation, paying attention to what's morally relevant, trying to hit the mean, caring about doing the right thing. Bad people accumulate experience without developing practical wisdom because they're paying attention to the wrong things, pursuing the wrong goals, developing skill at vice rather than virtue. This creates a puzzle Aristotle recognizes. You need virtue to develop practical wisdom, because only the virtuous person perceives situations correctly, judges what's truly good, aims at the right target. But you need practical wisdom to exercise virtue, because without it, you can't determine what the virtuous response requires. They seem to depend on each other, creating a circle. Aristotle's answer: they develop together in a spiral. You start with basic good habits instilled in childhood, following rules your parents teach, imitating people you respect. This isn't yet true virtue, because you're following external guidance rather than your own practical wisdom. But it starts forming your character, shaping your emotional responses, giving you some initial grasp of what virtue looks like. As your rational capacities mature, you begin understanding why these rules exist, what purposes they serve, how to apply them in new situations. Your practical wisdom develops as you reason about what to do, learn from experience, refine your judgment. And as your practical wisdom grows, your virtue becomes more complete, more flexible, more reliably excellent. Eventually, you reach the mature state where virtue and practical wisdom fully interpenetrate. You spontaneously perceive what situations demand. You respond appropriately without laborious deliberation. You hit the mean naturally because your character, emotions, and reason are all aligned. This is the person Aristotle calls spoudios, the excellent person, the one who serves as standard for ethical judgment. But what does practical wisdom actually look like in operation? Consider an extended example. A friend asks you to lie for them to protect them from consequences of their own mistake. You care about your friend and want to help, but you also value honesty and worry about enabling irresponsibility. What should you do? Practical wisdom begins by recognizing the genuine complexity. This isn't simply a conflict between friendship and honesty as abstract principles. It's a situation involving this particular friend, this particular mistake, these particular consequences, this particular relationship history, this particular request. The person with phronesis asks, what kind of help would truly benefit my friend? Sometimes protection from consequences enables continued bad behavior. Sometimes harsh lessons are exactly what someone needs. But sometimes consequences are disproportionate to mistakes, and a friend should offer shelter, which is this. They consider, what does my friend need to hear right now? A refusal to lie might communicate respect for their ability to handle difficulty, or it might feel like abandonment when they're vulnerable. How strong is our friendship? Can it bear the strain of my refusing? Would refusing strengthen or damage it? They weigh. What are the actual stakes? Will this lie enable serious harm to my friend or others? Will the truth lead to catastrophic consequences? Or are the stakes relatively minor, more about comfort than genuine well-being? They think through, what are the alternatives? Maybe there's a way to help without lying, to support while still being honest, to stand beside my friend without endorsing their evasion. Notice what's happening here. Practical wisdom doesn't consult some ethical decision procedure, doesn't apply an algorithm, doesn't reduce the situation to a simple case of conflicting principles. It perceives the situation in all its particularity, brings various considerations to bear, exercises judgment about what would be good here and now. And crucially, it does this quickly. The person with developed phronesis doesn't labour through all these considerations explicitly. They see what's required almost immediately, the way an expert chef tastes a dish and knows what it needs. The deliberation I've spelled out happens rapidly, often non-consciously, leading to a clear sense of the right course of action. This is why practical wisdom is an intellectual virtue, but one closely connected to moral virtue. It's not purely cognitive, not simply a matter of clever reasoning. Your emotions, desires, character, all influence how you perceive situations and what responses seem reasonable. The vicious person lacks practical wisdom, not because they're stupid, but because their distorted character makes them perceive situations wrongly, see apparent goods as real goods, miss what's truly important. Take the same situation with someone lacking practical wisdom. They might not even recognize the ethical complexity, might think it's simply about whether they're willing to inconvenience themselves for their friend. Or they might see the ethical dimension but reason poorly about it, either thinking loyalty always trumps honesty, or thinking honesty always requires blunt truth-telling regardless of circumstances. They lack the nuanced perception and judgment that practical wisdom provides. Or consider someone with practical wisdom navigating a different challenge. You're in a meeting where a colleague takes credit for your work. What does virtue require? Practical wisdom helps you see this clearly. First, assess the stakes. Is this a pattern or an isolated incident? Did your colleague do this maliciously or through genuine confusion about contributions? Will this significantly harm your career or reputation, or is it relatively minor? Then consider responses. You could publicly correct the record, but is this the right forum? Would doing so create unnecessary conflict? Or would silence enable ongoing injustice? You could address it privately with your colleague, but will that be effective, or do you need to involve others? Think about your relationship with this colleague. Is there a history of mutual respect that makes a gentle private conversation likely to work? Or is this part of a pattern requiring stronger action? Consider the organizational culture. Will speaking up be respected or seen as petty? Does the organization value truth-telling or smooth relationships? Weigh your own emotional state. Are you angry in a way that will make you respond more harshly than the situation warrants? Or is your anger appropriate, giving you the energy to address genuine injustice? Practical wisdom synthesizes all this into a clear sense of what to do. Maybe it says, address it privately first, calmly but directly, giving your colleague a chance to correct it themselves, but be prepared to escalate if they don't. Or maybe it says, this is minor, let it go, not every battle needs fighting. Or maybe it says, this requires immediate public correction because silence would mislead important people. There's no formula that determines the answer. Two people with practical wisdom might reach different conclusions depending on their particular knowledge of the people and context involved. but both would be exercising genuine practical wisdom in their perception and reasoning. Now notice something important about the relationship between practical wisdom and happiness. Remember, eudaimonia is activity in accordance with virtue, but you can't reliably act in accordance with virtue without practical wisdom. The well-intentioned person who lacks phronesis will frequently choose wrongly, missing the mean, pursuing apparent goods rather than real ones, causing harm despite good intentions. So practical wisdom is essential for flourishing. It's the intellectual virtue that enables all the moral virtues to operate correctly. Without it, courage becomes recklessness or cowardice, generosity becomes wastefulness or stinginess, honesty becomes brutal tactlessness or deceptive flattery. Practical wisdom is what transforms good intentions into good actions, moral principles into ethical life. But Aristotle recognizes something else. Practical wisdom can't be taught directly. You can teach someone geometry by proving theorems. You can teach them physics by explaining laws of nature. But you can't teach them practical wisdom the same way. Why? Because practical wisdom is about particulars, and particulars can't be captured in universal rules. Instead, practical wisdom is cultivated through three methods. First, experience. Face many situations, try various responses, observe what works, learn from mistakes. The person with practical wisdom has seen enough cases to recognize patterns, understand consequences, predict outcomes. Second, imitation. Learn from people who already have practical wisdom. Watch how they handle difficult situations. Ask them for advice. Model your responses on theirs until you develop your own judgment. Just as apprentices learn crafts from masters, moral learners develop phronesis by observing and imitating the spoudios. Third, habituation in virtue. Practical wisdom and moral virtue develop together. As you practice acting virtuously, you gradually see situations more clearly, judge more reliably, understand what virtue requires. Your character formation enhances your perception and reasoning. This long development explains why Aristotle thinks young people can't have practical wisdom. Not because they're stupid, but because they lack experience. They haven't faced enough situations, haven't learned from enough mistakes, haven't had time to develop the perceptual sensitivity that phronesis requires. This is also why the young can be skilled at mathematics or chess, but not at ethical reasoning. The former depend on abilities they already possess. The latter requires experience they haven't yet accumulated. The implication is humbling. You can't shortcut the development of practical wisdom. You can't read a book on ethics and suddenly possess phronesis. You must live, act, experience, reflect, learn, grow. It takes years, decades, a lifetime. The development of practical wisdom is the work of a complete life. But here's the hopeful part. The development is possible. You can become someone with practical wisdom through sustained effort over time. And as you develop it, making good choices becomes easier, more natural, more reliable. Eventually you become the person others turn to for ethical advice, the one who sees clearly when others are confused, who knows what to do when situations are complex. This is moral expertise, and like any expertise, it transforms how you experience the world. The expert musician hears nuances in performances others miss. The expert chef tastes subtleties others overlook. The person with practical wisdom perceives ethical dimensions of situations others don't notice, sees possibilities for action others don't recognize, understands consequences others don't anticipate. And this expertise serves eudaimonia directly. It enables you to act excellently, to exercise virtue reliably, to navigate life's complexities without constantly stumbling. Practical wisdom makes flourishing possible by giving you the tools to live well consistently over time. But how does this development happen? How do we actually become virtuous? This brings us to one of Aristotle's most important psychological insights. We are not born virtuous or vicious. Human infants are born with capacities for virtue, with the raw material, but not with virtue itself. A child can become courageous or cowardly, generous or stingy, just or unjust. Which they become depends on their formation. This formation happens through habituation, through repeated practice, through the gradual shaping of character. We become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, courageous by doing courageous acts. The famous analogy, we learn to play the harp by playing it, we become builders by building, we become good by doing good. But this raises an obvious question, one that puzzled commentators for centuries. If we become virtuous by acting virtuously, how do we perform the first virtuous acts before we're virtuous? It seems impossible. Like saying, you learn to swim by swimming, but how can you swim before you know how to swim? Aristotle's answer involves distinguishing stages of moral development. In childhood, we act virtuously through external guidance. Parents and teachers tell us what to do. We obey rules we don't yet fully understand. We imitate people we respect. We follow social conventions. At this stage, we're doing virtuous acts without having virtue as a settled disposition. This childhood formation is crucial. Through it, we develop the right emotional responses. We learn to take pleasure in noble actions and pain in shameful ones. Our desires begin aligning with what's genuinely good. We build the foundation on which virtue will eventually stand. As we mature and our rational capacities develop, we begin understanding why these rules exist, what purposes they serve. We internalize the principles rather than just following external commands. We start choosing virtuous acts for their own sake, because we recognize them as good, not merely because authority figures say so. Eventually, for those who successfully develop, virtue becomes a settled hexis, a stable disposition. Now we spontaneously perceive what situations require. We feel appropriate emotions and perform appropriate actions without constant deliberation. The struggle diminishes. Virtuous action flows naturally from who we've become. This is true virtue, choosing virtuous acts for their own sake, from a stable character with the right emotions and motivations. It's qualitatively different from simply performing the same external behaviors out of fear of punishment or hope for reward. But the transition between stages isn't always smooth. Many people get stuck in intermediate states, understanding intellectually what they should do, but finding themselves unable to do it consistently. Aristotle has a name for this frustrating condition, akrasia, usually translated as weakness of will or incontinence. The person with akrasia knows what's right. They genuinely believe they should exercise, control their temper, resist the extra dessert, do the work they've been avoiding. But when the moment comes, they act against their better judgment. They do what they know they shouldn't and immediately regret it. This phenomenon puzzled Greek philosophers. How is akrasia possible? If you truly know what's good, why would you choose what's bad? Socrates had argued that akrasia is impossible. If you choose badly, you must not really know what's good. What looks like choosing bad while knowing good is actually not knowing at all. Aristotle disagrees. Akrasia is real. People genuinely do act against their knowledge. But how? His explanation involves distinguishing different ways of having knowledge. You can know something in an abstract, theoretical way without that knowledge being active and operative in your current situation. Like the drunk person who can recite moral principles but can't apply them to their own behavior right now. When desire overwhelms reason, your knowledge becomes merely potential rather than actual. You have the information stored somewhere but can't access it effectively. Your emotions or appetites override your rational judgment in the moment. Afterwards, when desire subsides, your knowledge becomes active again, and you wonder how you could have acted so foolishly. The person with complete virtue doesn't face this problem because their emotions and reason are aligned. They don't just know intellectually what's good, they desire it emotionally. Their appetites have been shaped through habituation to want what's genuinely worth wanting, so they don't experience the internal conflict that characterizes akrasia. This explains why moral formation must start young, before reason fully develops. If you wait until someone is an adult to start instilling virtue, their emotional responses are already set. They can understand intellectually why virtue matters, but their desires pull in opposite directions. Achieving virtue becomes much harder, maybe impossible. But this raises troubling questions. If character formation depends on childhood habituation, does that mean people who had bad upbringings are doomed? Can someone with vicious character ever reform? Or is virtue available only to those lucky enough to receive proper early training? Aristotle is somewhat pessimistic here. He thinks character change is very difficult once dispositions are set. The person whose appetites were poorly formed in youth will struggle to achieve virtue later. Not impossible, but requiring tremendous sustained effort, working against ingrained patterns, fighting one's own habituated responses. This is one reason why Aristotle emphasizes the importance of good laws and proper education. Society has responsibility to raise children well, to instill virtue in the young, to create conditions that enable character formation. The person with proper upbringing has a massive advantage in achieving eudaimonia. Those denied this advantage face much steeper paths, but even with good upbringing, moral development continues throughout life. You don't achieve complete virtue at age 20 and then simply maintain it. Rather, virtue deepens and matures through continued experience and reflection. The courage of a young soldier differs from the courage of a seasoned leader. The justice of an apprentice judge differs from the justice of a wise elder. Practical wisdom develops gradually as you face new situations, learn from mistakes, refine your judgment. This means moral development is lifelong work. You never reach a point where you can relax, where virtue is so secure you need not attend to it anymore. Until your complete life ends, the project of becoming excellent continues. But here's the encouraging part. Progress is genuinely possible at any stage, even if you start with disadvantages, even if your character formation was poor, even if you've made countless mistakes, you can still move toward virtue. Maybe you won't achieve the complete virtue of someone with every advantage, but you can become better than you were, more virtuous than you are, closer to excellence than you started. The path requires honesty about your current state, clear vision of where you want to go, sustained effort in practicing virtue, patience with setbacks, and perhaps most importantly, surrounding yourself with virtuous people who model excellence and support your development. Because you can't become virtuous alone. We are social creatures, shaped by our communities, influenced by those around us. The company we keep forms our character as surely as our own choices do. This brings us to one of the most beautiful aspects of Aristotle's ethics, his account of friendship. No one, Aristotle says, would choose to live without friends, even if he had all other goods. Not wealth, not honor, not pleasure, not even virtue itself could make a life good without friendship. Friendship is not optional for eudaimonia, but essential, not an extra pleasure, but a necessary component of human flourishing. The Greek word philia, translated as friendship, has broader scope than our English word. It includes family affection, romantic love, civic bonds, collegial relationships, and what we'd call friendship in the narrow sense. Aristotle examines all these forms, but he's most interested in what he calls complete or perfect friendship, the highest form of human relationship. To understand complete friendship, we must distinguish it from two lesser forms. First, friendships of utility. These relationships exist because each person is useful to the other. Business partners, professional networks, neighbors who help each other, colleagues who collaborate, all exemplify friendships of utility. Nothing wrong with such relationships, but they're inherently fragile. When the usefulness ends, the friendship dissolves. Second, friendships of pleasure. These relationships exist because each person enjoys the other's company. Drinking buddies, hobby companions, people you have fun with, romantic relationships based primarily on physical attraction, all exemplify friendships of pleasure. Again, nothing wrong with them, but they're conditional. When you no longer find each other pleasant, when tastes change or circumstances shift, the friendship fades. Both utility friendships and pleasure friendships are real friendships in Aristotle's view. They involve genuine affection, though in a qualified way. But they're incomplete, instrumental, based on what each person gets from the other rather than on who the other person is. Complete friendship is different. It exists between good people who are similar in virtue. Each loves the other for who they are, not for what they provide. Each wishes good for the other's sake, not as means to their own benefit. The foundation is mutual recognition of each other's excellence of character. Such friendship requires several conditions. First, both people must be virtuous. Complete friendship can exist only between good people because only good people can consistently will genuine good for others. The vicious person is too focused on their own gratification to truly care about another's well-being as an end in itself. Second, they must recognize each other's virtue. You can't be friends with someone you don't know well enough to appreciate their character. Complete friendship requires intimacy, time spent together, shared experiences that reveal who each person truly is. Third, they must wish each other well for each other's sake, not for what the friendship does for themselves. This is the hardest condition to understand, because good friends do benefit from friendship. But in complete friendship, you care about your friend's good as an end, not merely as means to your own happiness. This creates an interesting philosophical puzzle. Aristotle says, the friend is another self. In loving your friend, you extend to them the appropriate self-love you have for yourself. But how is this possible? How can I love another person's good as much as my own? Doesn't this violate basic egoism? Aristotle's answer reveals something profound about human identity. We are not atomic individuals sealed off from others, fundamentally separate. Rather, our good is essentially social. When my friend flourishes, my own life is enriched. When they suffer, I am diminished. Not because I'm using them for my benefit, but because our lives are genuinely interconnected. Their eudaimonia becomes part of my eudaimonia. Think of what this means. Complete friendship isn't an addition to an already complete life, a nice bonus if you can get it. It's constitutive of eudaimonia itself. The solitary person, no matter how virtuous or intelligent or accomplished, cannot achieve complete flourishing. We need friends not as instruments for other goods, but as essential components of living well. Why? Several reasons. First, friends enable our own virtue. We become better people through association with good people. Their example inspires us. Their feedback corrects us. Their expectations hold us accountable. Trying to become virtuous alone is extraordinarily difficult. With virtuous friends, the path becomes clearer and more achievable. Second, friends provide the context for exercising many virtues. Justice finds its highest expression in relationships between equals. Generosity manifests most beautifully in giving to friends. Even courage and temperance are strengthened by acting together with others who share our commitment to excellence. Virtue practiced with friends becomes more complete than virtue practiced alone. Third, friends enhance our understanding. Through conversation, we clarify our thoughts, test our ideas, see things from new perspectives. The friend acts as mirror and lens, reflecting back to us aspects of ourselves we might not perceive, focusing our attention on truths we might overlook. Philosophical understanding deepens through dialogue with friends. Fourth, friends multiply our joys and divide our sorrows. Achievements feel more meaningful when celebrated together. Difficulties seem more bearable when faced with support. This isn't merely psychological comfort, though it's that too. It's about the amplification of good and the distribution of burden that complete friendship provides. Fifth, and perhaps most profoundly, friends provide someone to be excellent for. The virtuous person wants to act excellently, but excellence requires context, requires others who recognize and appreciate it, requires shared commitment to what's genuinely good. Friends create the space where virtue can be fully expressed and appropriately valued. But complete friendship is rare. Why? Because it requires virtue in both parties, and virtue itself is rare, because it requires time and intimacy, and most people lack the opportunity for deep connection with many others, because it requires reciprocity of affection and recognition, and finding someone who both appreciates your virtue and whom you appreciate is uncommon. Aristotle thinks you can have only a few complete friendships, not because you should limit them artificially, but because the conditions make having many impossible. You simply don't have time for intimate relationship with dozens of people. You can't share life deeply enough with large numbers to achieve the recognition and reciprocity that complete friendship requires. This doesn't mean you shouldn't have utility friendships or pleasure friendships with many people. Those relationships serve important functions and enrich life. But the deepest form of friendship, the kind that's essential to eudaimonia, can exist with only a handful of people at most. What do friends do together? Share virtuous activities, Aristotle says, not merely spend time in each other's presence, but engage in excellent activity together, study philosophy together, work for justice together, pursue understanding together, raise children together, build communities together. The content matters less than the shared commitment to excellence. This is why Aristotle emphasizes that friends must spend time together. Friendship isn't maintained by goodwill from a distance. You must actually live significant parts of your life with your friends, engaging in shared activity, creating common history. The modern challenge of maintaining friendships across great distances would have seemed to Aristotle to threaten friendship's very possibility. But what about relationships where one person is clearly superior in virtue or wisdom or social position? Can friendship exist between unequals? Aristotle's answer is nuanced. Complete friendship requires equality in the relevant sense. Both people must be virtuous and recognize each other as such. But this doesn't mean equality in every respect. The philosopher can be friends with the student if the student has enough virtue to appreciate excellence and enough wisdom to recognize it in the teacher. The parent can be friends with the adult child if mutual respect and recognition exist. The ruler can be friends with the citizen if both are committed to justice and the common good. What matters is that each receives from the relationship in proportion to what they contribute. Not mathematical equality, but proportionate equality. The student receives more wisdom, the teacher receives more honor, the child receives more care, the parent receives more gratitude, the citizen receives more protection, the ruler receives more support. As long as these proportionate exchanges occur with appropriate reciprocity, friendship can exist even between unequals. This understanding of friendship connects to Aristotle's Politics, a topic we'll explore more fully. For now, note that he thinks political communities require something like friendship to function well. Not that all citizens must be close personal friends, but that civic bonds share something with friendship structure: mutual goodwill, shared commitment to common good, recognition of each other as valuable members of the community. The best city-states, Aristotle argues, cultivate this civic friendship or concord. Citizens care about each other's well-being, not just instrumentally, but as ends in themselves. They deliberate together about the common good rather than competing for purely private interests. They create conditions where everyone can flourish rather than some thriving at others' expense. This is one reason why excessive inequality threatens political health. When gaps between rich and poor become too wide, civic friendship becomes impossible. The rich can't see the poor as similar in virtue because the poor lack opportunities to develop virtue. The poor can't recognize themselves in the rich because their lives are too different. Political conflict replaces mutual goodwill, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before exploring politics, we need to complete our understanding of Aristotle's account of Eudaimonia. Because there's one more component we haven't yet addressed, one that complicates everything we've said so far. Remember, Aristotle defined eudaimonia as activity of soul in accordance with virtue over a complete life. We've explored virtue extensively, examined practical wisdom, investigated moral development. But there's an intellectual component to eudaimonia we've barely mentioned: the life of contemplation. In Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle makes a surprising claim. The happiest life, he says, is the contemplative life, the life devoted to philosophy and understanding for their own sake, not the life of moral virtue, not the life of political engagement, but the life of theoria, of intellectual contemplation of truth. This seems to contradict everything that came before. After spending 9 books discussing moral virtue, practical wisdom, action in the world, suddenly Aristotle elevates a life of pure thought above everything else. What's going on? The contemplative life deserves its place as highest eudaimonia, Aristotle argues, because it exercises the highest part of human nature, the intellect. While moral virtue involves our emotions, our relationships with others, our bodily nature, contemplation is purely intellectual. It engages reason at its purest, understanding reality for the sake of understanding itself. Think about what happens in contemplation. You study mathematics, working through proofs, understanding necessary relationships. You investigate the structure of reality, examining the causes that explain why things are as they are. You explore philosophical questions about knowledge, being, goodness. In all of this, you're exercising theoretical wisdom, Sophia, the intellectual virtue that grasps fundamental truths. What makes this activity so excellent? Several factors. First, it's the most self-sufficient activity. Moral virtue requires other people. Politics requires a community. Even practical wisdom needs situations to navigate. But contemplation can be pursued alone. Give a philosopher books and time to think, and they can engage in the highest activity human beings are capable of. Second, it's the most continuous activity. You can't be courageous all the time, because danger doesn't always threaten. You can't be generous constantly because opportunities for giving are limited. But you can contemplate for extended periods, hours on end, returning to it day after day. The contemplative life can fill your waking hours in a way the active life cannot. Third, it's the most pleasant activity, at least for those capable of it. The pleasures of understanding, of intellectual discovery, of grasping truth, surpass bodily pleasures in intensity and duration. They don't depend on external circumstances or physical conditions. They don't lead to satiety or regret. Once you've tasted the pleasure of philosophical understanding, other pleasures pale by comparison. Fourth, contemplation is loved for itself, not for any consequence. We contemplate because understanding is intrinsically worthwhile, not because it leads to something else. This makes it the most final activity, the one that best fits the definition of ultimate good pursued for its own sake. Finally, and most importantly, contemplation is the most godlike activity available to humans. The gods, Aristotle argues, engage in eternal contemplation. They think about thinking itself, understanding the highest truths in perfect actuality. They don't need moral virtue because they face no challenges requiring courage, no appetites requiring temperance, no others requiring justice. Their activity is pure contemplation. When we contemplate, we participate in divine activity. We transcend, however briefly, our animal nature. We rise above the bodily and emotional aspects of human life to engage in the purely intellectual activity that constitutes divine existence. In contemplation, we become most truly ourselves precisely by becoming most like God. This vision of the contemplative life raises many questions. Is Aristotle suggesting we should all become philosophers, abandoning practical life for pure study? Is he contradicting his earlier emphasis on moral virtue and political engagement? Or is there a way to integrate contemplation with the active life? Aristotle is aware of these tensions. He acknowledges that the contemplative life is too high for man. We're not pure intellects, but embodied creatures with physical needs, emotional nature, social dependencies. We can't sustain contemplation continuously. We need food, sleep, relationships, engagement with the world. The purely contemplative life is an ideal we can approximate but never fully achieve. Moreover, contemplation requires favourable external conditions. You need leisure, freedom from pressing material concerns, education, books, perhaps colleagues to discuss ideas with. The philosopher needs a supportive community that allows them to withdraw from practical affairs. Not everyone has access to these conditions. The contemplative life, like all forms of eudaimonia, requires good fortune. But here's Aristotle's nuanced position. The contemplative life is the highest form of eudaimonia, the most divine, the most complete expression of human nature at its best. But the life of moral and political virtue constitutes a secondary form of eudaimonia, genuinely excellent, though less perfect than contemplation. Most people will pursue this secondary happiness, engaging in virtuous action in the world, forming friendships, participating in political community, exercising practical wisdom in navigating life's challenges. This is genuinely good, genuinely fulfilling, genuinely a form of flourishing. It's just not the absolute peak of what human beings are capable of. The best life, then, might combine both. Virtuous action providing the foundation and context, contemplation providing moments of highest activity. You engage in politics or profession or family life, exercising moral virtues, developing practical wisdom, forming friendships. But you also make time for study, for understanding, for the intellectual activity that lifts you beyond immediate concerns into timeless truth. This mixed life fits most people better than either pure contemplation or pure action. And it makes sense of the relationship between moral and intellectual virtue. Moral virtue creates the stable character and organized life that makes sustained contemplation possible. Practical wisdom ensures you exercise moral virtue correctly. Contemplation, in turn, enriches your active life with perspective, meaning, connection, to what's eternal. For someone living in the modern world, far from ancient Athens, what does this mean practically? How do we cultivate the contemplative dimension of flourishing alongside the active dimension? Perhaps it means reading philosophy, engaging seriously with ideas, thinking about fundamental questions rather than only immediate concerns. Perhaps it means studying mathematics, science, history, any discipline that expands understanding. Perhaps it means appreciating art, music, literature, the cultural achievements that invite contemplation of beauty and meaning. Perhaps it simply means making space in your life for thinking, for wondering, for pursuing understanding because understanding matters, not because it serves some practical purpose, resisting the constant pressure toward productivity and utility, valuing knowledge for its own sake rather than only for what it enables you to do. The contemplative life in this sense isn't restricted to professional philosophers. Anyone can pursue understanding. Anyone can exercise theoretical reason. Anyone can participate in the intellectual activity that Aristotle sees as highest human activity. The question is whether we make room for it, whether we value it enough to dedicate time and attention to it. And there's something deeply consoling about Aristotle's elevation of the contemplative life. It suggests that human flourishing isn't reducible to success in career, relationships, pleasures, achievements. Even if all those go well, life lacks something essential without the intellectual dimension, without engagement with truth for its own sake, without the activity of understanding. Conversely, even if practical life is frustrating, even if your circumstances limit your ability to exercise moral virtue fully, even if illness or poverty or bad fortune constrain your options, you can still engage in contemplation. You can still think, learn, understand. This highest form of human activity remains available even when others are foreclosed. But contemplation alone isn't enough. We're embodied social creatures, not disembodied minds. We need the full life, moral virtue, giving character, practical wisdom guiding action, friends providing relationship, community creating context, and woven through it all, moments of contemplation lifting us beyond immediate concerns into timeless truth. This complete vision of eudaimonia brings us finally to politics. Because the good life for individuals can't be separated from the good life of communities. We are political animals, Aristotle famously says. Our nature is to live in cities, to participate in collective self-governance, to pursue common goods together. Understanding human flourishing requires understanding political community. The phrase political animal needs careful interpretation. Aristotle doesn't just mean we happen to live in groups, or that political organization is useful. He means we're naturally, essentially, political. Our distinctive human capacity for reason manifests not just in individual thought, but in collective deliberation about justice and the good. Speech isn't merely for indicating pleasure and pain like animal sounds. It's for discussing what's advantageous and just, examining together what we should do and how we should live. The city-state, the polis, exists for the sake of eudaimonia, not merely for survival, though it provides security, not merely for prosperity, though it enables economic exchange. The political community's ultimate purpose is to create conditions where citizens can flourish, where human beings can achieve their proper excellence. This means politics isn't a separate sphere from ethics. The question, how should I live, and the question, how should we organize our community, are intimately connected. My ability to develop virtue depends partly on the laws and institutions of my community. The city's success depends partly on the character of its citizens. Ethics and politics form one continuous inquiry into human good. What makes a political community good? Aristotle's answer, one that promotes the common good rather than serving the private interests of rulers. The good forms of government, whether monarchy or aristocracy or polity, aim at what benefits all citizens. The corrupted forms, whether tyranny or oligarchy or democracy in the negative sense, serve only those who rule. But what is the common good? Not just aggregate private goods, not simply the sum of individual interests. The common good is the shared conditions that enable all citizens to flourish, good laws that habituate virtue, just institutions that treat citizens fairly, educational systems that develop character and intellect, economic arrangements that provide necessary material conditions, the entire social architecture that makes eudaimonia possible. This is why Aristotle emphasizes the importance of law. Laws aren't merely coercive restrictions on freedom. Properly crafted, they're instruments of moral education, habituating citizens to virtue from youth. The child who grows up in a well-governed city learns to act justly through following just laws, develops courage through proper military training, cultivates temperance through social norms around pleasure and self-control. Bad laws have the opposite effect. They corrupt character, teach vice, make virtue difficult or impossible. The city with unjust institutions forms unjust citizens. The community organized around private gain breeds selfish individuals. This is why choosing good government matters so much. It determines not just material prosperity, but the character of those who live under it. Aristotle's analysis of constitutions examines how different political arrangements promote or undermine eudaimonia. Monarchy, ruled by one excellent person, can be excellent if that ruler possesses virtue and practical wisdom and genuinely cares about the common good. But it easily corrupts into tyranny when the ruler pursues private interest. Aristocracy, ruled by the few best, works well when those few are truly virtuous and wise, but it degenerates into oligarchy when the few wealthy rule for their own benefit rather than the common good. Polity, ruled by the many, succeeds when citizens are educated, virtuous, and deliberate together about what's just. But it becomes mere democracy in Aristotle's negative sense when the poor many pursue their class interest against the wealthy few. Which constitution is best? Aristotle is pragmatic. The best in theory is ruled by the perfectly virtuous person or persons, but such people are rare. In practice, a mixed constitution that combines elements of oligarchy and democracy, that gives both wealthy and poor a voice while preventing either from dominating, tends to be most stable and most conducive to the common good. This mixed constitution, polity, works best in cities with a large middle class. Why? Because the middle class moderates between extremes. Not so wealthy, they become arrogant and disconnected from common concerns. Not so poor, they become envious and desperate. They have enough to live decently, but not enough to corrupt. They're invested in stability, but open to gradual improvement. The vision is remarkably democratic for its time, though still limited by Greek prejudices. Aristotle thinks citizenship should be relatively widespread, that many should participate in deliberation about the common good, that rotation in offices prevents concentration of power. The good city encourages active participation rather than passive subjection. But his vision remains exclusionary in ways we must reject. He defended slavery as natural, argued that some humans are suited only to serve others, justified exploitation of those he considered inferior. This is morally abhorrent, contradicted by what we now know about human equality and universal dignity. Similarly, Aristotle excluded women from citizenship, considered them naturally subordinate to men, denied them the opportunity for full development of rational capacities. Again, this is indefensible, rooted in the prejudices of his culture rather than sound reasoning. And his view that Greeks were naturally superior to barbarians, that non-Greeks existed to be ruled by Greeks, reflects a cultural chauvinism we must unequivocally reject. These errors matter. They're not incidental features we can ignore while accepting the rest of Aristotle's politics. They reveal how even brilliant philosophers can be limited by their historical circumstances, how unquestioned assumptions can corrupt otherwise sound reasoning, how we must always read critically rather than accepting authority blindly. But we can learn from Aristotle's political insights while rejecting his prejudices. The core idea remains valuable. Political communities exist to enable human flourishing. Good government creates conditions for citizens to develop virtue and exercise it excellently. Justice requires distributing benefits and burdens fairly. Citizens should participate actively in collective self-governance. Applied to contemporary politics, these principles suggest questions we should ask about any society. Do our laws and institutions promote character development? Do economic arrangements enable most people to acquire the education and resources necessary for flourishing? Do political structures encourage active participation or create apathy? Does the distribution of wealth and power allow for civic friendship? Or does excessive inequality fracture community? Aristotle would likely critique contemporary democracies for failing to educate citizens in virtue, for allowing wealth to corrupt political processes, for fragmenting civic identity through excessive individualism. But he would also recognize the expansion of citizenship beyond his limited vision, the rejection of slavery and subjugation, the opportunity for more people to develop their capacities. The task in any era is to structure communities to promote eudaimonia as widely as possible, not to guarantee happiness, which depends partly on individual effort and choice, but to create conditions where pursuing excellence is possible, where virtue is encouraged, where people have genuine opportunities to flourish. This requires attention to multiple dimensions: material, adequate resources, economic opportunity, security from violence and deprivation, educational. Schools that develop both moral and intellectual virtues prepare people for active citizenship. Social, institutions that bring people together across differences, create opportunities for civic friendship. Legal, just laws that treat people fairly, habituate virtue, protect rights. No society perfectly achieves these conditions. But the question isn't perfection, but direction. Are we moving toward or away from arrangements that enable widespread flourishing? Are our policies conducive to virtue development or corrosive of character? Do our institutions promote common good or serve only narrow interests? These questions remain as urgent today as in Aristotle's Athens, perhaps more so, given our greater power, our global interconnection, our capacity for both tremendous good and tremendous harm. The ancient philosophers' insistence that politics matters morally, that political arrangements shape character, that communities bear responsibility for creating conditions that enable flourishing, speaks directly to our contemporary challenges. But politics and ethics together don't exhaust Aristotle's philosophy. He developed comprehensive accounts of knowledge, logic, metaphysics, biology. The intellectual virtues he discusses aren't limited to practical wisdom. Understanding his full vision of human excellence requires examining the life of mind in multiple dimensions. Aristotle distinguishes 5 intellectual virtues, 5 excellences of thinking that human beings can develop. We've explored practical wisdom extensively, but there are 4 others, each with its characteristic domain and method. Scientific knowledge, episteme, grasps universal necessary truths through demonstration. It's the knowledge you have when you understand not just that something is so, but why it must be so. Mathematical. Proofs exemplify episteme. You don't just see that the theorem is true, you understand why it couldn't be otherwise, following logical necessity from axioms to conclusion. Intuitive reason, nous, grasps first principles directly. These are the starting points for reasoning, the axioms and assumptions that demonstrations build on. They can't themselves be proven, because all proof depends on them. But they're not arbitrary. No perceives them as self-evident truths, foundations that require no further justification because nothing could be more certain. Together, episteme and nous constitute theoretical wisdom, Sophia. The person with Sophia both grasps first principles through intuitive reason and understands what follows from them through scientific knowledge. They have systematic understanding of reality's fundamental structure. This is the highest intellectual virtue, the one exercised in contemplation, the peak of human cognitive achievement. Practical wisdom, phronesis, we've already examined. Its excellence in deliberating about what conduces to living well, about how to act in particular situations to achieve good ends. Unlike theoretical wisdom, which grasps unchanging truths, practical wisdom deals with contingent matters, things that could be otherwise, situations requiring judgment and choice. Craft knowledge, techne, is excellence in making or producing things. The carpenter has techne regarding construction, the chef regarding cooking, the physician regarding healing. Like practical wisdom, techne deals with variable matters, things that depend on human choice and skill. But unlike practical wisdom, which aims at action itself, techne aims at producing some external product. These 5 intellectual virtues correspond to different ways reason engages with reality. Theoretical wisdom grasps what's necessarily so. Practical wisdom discerns what should be done. Craft knowledge produces what's useful or beautiful. Each is valuable, each develops different capacities, each contributes to complete human excellence. But they're not equally valuable. Aristotle ranks them, considering theoretical wisdom highest because it grasps the most important truths, deals with what's most divine, exercises reason at its purest. Practical wisdom comes next, enabling the excellent action that constitutes moral virtue. Craft knowledge is valuable but lower, concerned with mere production rather than action or understanding. This hierarchy reflects Aristotle's metaphysics, his understanding of reality's structure. At the top is the unmoved mover, pure actuality, thought thinking itself, the divine principle that makes all motion and change possible. Human theoretical wisdom participates in this divine intellection, understanding the unchanging principles that govern reality. Below the divine comes the realm of nature, studied by natural philosophy and biology. Here Aristotle spent enormous energy observing animals, categorizing species, investigating life's principles. The natural world has its own structures and purposes, its own wisdom to discover. Further down is the realm of human action, governed by practical wisdom, the sphere of ethics and politics, where we create good lives and communities through choice and habituation. At the bottom is the realm of production, where craft knowledge operates, making useful objects and beautiful artifacts. Each domain requires appropriate intellectual virtue. You can't understand mathematics through practical wisdom or determine ethical action through theoretical wisdom. Each type of knowledge has its proper sphere and method, but all contribute to eudaimonia. The complete life includes all the intellectual virtues operating in their proper domains. Theoretical wisdom in contemplation of truth, practical wisdom in living well, scientific knowledge in systematic understanding, intuitive reason in grasping principles, even craft knowledge in making useful and beautiful things. This comprehensive vision of intellectual excellence reminds us that human flourishing involves the full development of our rational capacities in all directions. Not just moral virtue, not just practical success, not just theoretical understanding, but the complete cultivation of mind in its various operations. For someone reading Aristotle today, this suggests the value of broad education. Learn mathematics to develop scientific reasoning, study philosophy to cultivate theoretical wisdom, engage in ethics to develop practical wisdom, master some craft to develop productive skill, exercise intuitive reason by examining foundational assumptions. Each form of learning develops different capacities, trains different aspects of intellect, contributes distinctively to the life of mind. The educated person isn't narrowly specialized but broadly cultivated, able to think well across multiple domains. But intellectual virtues alone don't constitute eudaimonia. We must return to the complete picture Aristotle paints, integrating all the elements we've explored into a coherent vision of human flourishing. The Aristotelian good life combines multiple components, all necessary, working together. It requires moral virtue, the settled dispositions that enable excellent action. It requires practical wisdom, the judgment that applies virtue appropriately in particular situations. It requires adequate external goods, the material conditions that make sustained excellent activity possible. It requires friendship, the relationships that give life meaning and provide context for virtue. It requires political community, the social structures that enable and support flourishing. And it includes intellectual virtue, especially the contemplative activity that exercises our highest capacities. This is a demanding vision. Flourishing isn't easy, isn't guaranteed, isn't achieved through following simple formulas. It requires sustained effort over a complete life, favorable circumstances, good fortune, proper formation from youth, supportive community, intellectual development, and moral cultivation. But it's also an encouraging vision, because it suggests human beings are capable of genuine excellence, that we can develop noble character, that life can be deeply meaningful when lived well. The possibility of eudaimonia, however difficult to achieve, remains genuinely open to us. What would an Aristotelian life look like in practice? Let's sketch a day in such a life, recognizing that details vary with circumstances, that there's no single correct way to live excellently, but that certain patterns characterize flourishing. You wake with a sense of purpose, not dread. Your life has direction, aims at something genuinely worthwhile, allows you to exercise capacities you've developed through sustained effort. You've habituated yourself to rising at a reasonable hour, neither sleeping excessively nor depriving yourself of necessary rest. Morning offers time for contemplation. Perhaps you read philosophy, engaging seriously with ideas. Perhaps you study something that exercises theoretical reason, mathematics, history, science. Perhaps you simply think, reflecting on fundamental questions, exercising mind for its own sake. This isn't preparation for something else but valuable activity itself. Work occupies much of your day. Not any work, but work that allows exercise of excellence. If you're fortunate, you've found a role that uses your distinctive abilities, contributes to common good, allows you to develop craft or intellectual or leadership skills. If not, you're working to change circumstances, or at least finding ways to exercise virtue within constraints. You approach work with practical wisdom, discerning what each situation requires, finding the mean between extremes, acting virtuously even in difficult circumstances, courage when confronting problems, temperance in managing success, justice in dealing with colleagues, generosity in helping others. Meals are occasions for both nourishment and social connection. You eat with temperance, enjoying food without excess. If possible, you share meals with friends or family, the conversation enriching the physical sustenance. You're present to those you're with, not distracted, not checking devices, but engaged in genuine human interaction. Afternoon continues productive activity, whether work or household responsibilities or civic engagement. You're contributing something, exercising capacities, participating in common life rather than merely consuming or withdrawing. Evening brings relaxation, but not mere passivity. Perhaps physical exercise, maintaining health through appropriate activity. Perhaps cultural engagement, attending to art or music or literature. Perhaps social time with friends, the complete friendship based on mutual virtue that Aristotle values so highly. Some evenings involve civic participation. You attend community meetings, engage in local politics, contribute to collective deliberation about common good. Not because it's always pleasant, but because political engagement is part of human excellence, part of our nature as political animals. Before sleep, time for reflection. You review the day, considering where you acted well and where you fell short, learning from mistakes, resolving to do better tomorrow. Not harsh self-criticism, but honest assessment aimed at continued growth in virtue. Throughout all this, your emotions are properly ordered. You feel fear when danger genuinely threatens but aren't paralyzed by anxiety. You experience anger at real injustice but aren't ruled by rage. You enjoy pleasures appropriately but aren't enslaved by appetites. Your emotional responses have been shaped through habituation to align with reason. Your relationships are structured appropriately. Family bonds combining natural affection with justice. Friendships of different types. Utility friendships with colleagues. Pleasure friendships with companions. Complete friendships with virtuous equals. All maintained through attention, time, reciprocal goodwill. You live in a community that enables your flourishing. Laws that promote virtue. Institutions that provide opportunities. Economic arrangements that allow for decent material conditions. Political structures that invite participation. Or if your community fails in these ways, you're working for improvement while doing your best under current circumstances. Your character is relatively stable. The virtues you've developed through years of habituation have become second nature. You spontaneously respond appropriately to situations. This doesn't mean you never struggle, never face temptation, never make mistakes. But the overall pattern is one of excellent activity flowing naturally from excellent character. This is what eudaimonia looks like in daily life. Not constant ecstasy, not freedom from all problems, not perfect circumstances, but meaningful activity, virtuous character, genuine relationships, intellectual engagement, political participation, proper emotional responses, all working together over time to constitute a flourishing human life. Of course, real life is messier than this sketch. External circumstances constrain us. Bad fortune strikes. We face situations where no clearly virtuous response exists. We make mistakes, harm people we care about, fall short of our ideals. We experience periods of despair, doubt, confusion. Aristotle acknowledges all this. His vision of eudaimonia is realistic, not utopian. He knows flourishing is vulnerable to fortune, that tragedy can strike even the virtuous, that maintaining excellence over a complete life is extremely difficult. But the vision remains worth pursuing, even if we never perfectly achieve it, even if circumstances prevent full flourishing, we can still move in that direction. We can still develop virtue, cultivate practical wisdom, form genuine friendships, engage in contemplation, participate in political community. We can still live better than we currently do, more excellently than we have been. And there's something deeply hopeful about Aristotle's insistence that eudaimonia depends primarily on what's within our control. Not entirely, not exclusively, but primarily. We can't control whether we're born into wealth or poverty, whether we're naturally intelligent or beautiful, whether fortune smiles or frowns, but we can control to a significant extent the development of our character. We can practice virtue, we can cultivate practical wisdom, we can choose friends wisely, we can engage seriously with ideas. These choices, repeated over years, compound into character. And character, more than circumstances, determines whether we flourish. The person with excellent character bears misfortune nobly. The person with vicious character squanders good fortune. External goods matter, but character matters more. This is why Aristotle's ethics remains relevant 23 centuries after he first lectured in the Lyceum. The question he posed to young Alexander, what does it mean to live well, remains our question. The answer he developed through decades of observation, analysis and reflection, excellence of character and intellect exercised over a complete life, still illuminates the path toward human flourishing. We can reject his prejudices, update his science, question his metaphysics, but his core psychological insights, his analysis of virtue and practical wisdom, his understanding of friendship and community, his vision of happiness as activity rather than feeling, all remain profoundly true to human experience. And there's something uniquely valuable about Aristotle's approach. Unlike moralists who offer rigid rules, he acknowledges the flexibility required for ethical living. Unlike relativists who claim there are no objective standards, he identifies genuine excellences rooted in human nature. Unlike abstract theorists who ignore psychology, he attends carefully to how character actually forms. Unlike pessimists who see virtue as impossible, he insists it's achievable though difficult. His philosophy is at once demanding and encouraging, realistic and idealistic, rigorous and humane. It challenges us to become better while acknowledging our limitations. It sets a high standard while insisting the standard is achievable. It takes human excellence seriously while recognizing we're complex creatures with bodies, emotions, relationships, not just pure intellects. As you settle into sleep, consider what Aristotle offers you. Not a simple formula for happiness, not a guarantee of success, not an easy path, but a comprehensive vision of human flourishing, a map of the territory you must cross, a companion for the journey toward excellence. He reminds you that happiness is something you do, not something that happens to you. That virtue is achievable through practice, not an inborn trait. That wisdom develops through experience, not just study. That friendship is essential, not optional. That community matters, not just individual achievement. That contemplation enriches life, not just practical success. He invites you to ask, what virtues am I cultivating? What habits am I forming? What is my character becoming through my repeated choices? Do I act courageously when courage is needed? Do I moderate pleasures appropriately? Do I give generously but wisely? Do I develop practical wisdom through attention to experience? He challenges you to examine, who are my friends? Do I have genuine friendships based on mutual recognition of virtue, or only relationships of utility and pleasure? Am I the kind of person capable of complete friendship? Am I someone others would want as a friend? He questions you. How do I spend my time? Is my life filled with excellent activity? Do I exercise my rational capacities? Do I engage in contemplation, pursuing understanding for its own sake? Or do I merely follow pleasures, pursue wealth, seek honours that ring hollow? He asks you, What kind of community do I help create? Do I participate in political life? Do I work for justice and the common good? Do I contribute to conditions that enable others to flourish? Or do I withdraw into private concerns, ignoring civic responsibilities? Most fundamentally, he poses the question that started our evening together. What does it mean for me to live well? What would flourishing look like for someone with my capacities, circumstances, opportunities? How do I move from where I am toward genuine excellence? These are not questions to answer tonight, here in the quiet dark. They're questions for a lifetime. Questions that each day presents anew. Questions that require continuous attention and reflection and choice. But asking them, taking them seriously, letting them guide your decisions, this itself moves you toward the Eudaimonia Aristotle describes. The ancient world Aristotle inhabited is long gone. The city-states have fallen. The gods he referenced no longer command worship. The scientific theories he proposed have been superseded. The social structures he took for granted have collapsed. But the questions remain. The capacity for virtue persists. The possibility of practical wisdom endures. The need for friendship continues. The desire for understanding burns as bright. The project of becoming excellent, of living well, of achieving eudaimonia, this remains the human project, as urgent now as when Aristotle walked through the Lyceum's covered pathways discussing it with his students. His answers aren't final. Each generation must adapt his insights to new circumstances, reject his errors, develop his principles in new directions. But his approach, beginning with human nature, examining actual experience, building systematic understanding, connecting ethics to politics, integrating thought and action, this remains a model for thinking seriously about how to live. And his conclusion, that human beings are capable of genuine excellence, that flourishing is possible through cultivation of virtue and wisdom, that happiness consists in excellent rational activity over a complete life. This remains a vision worth pursuing, worth striving toward, worth letting guide our choices even when fully achieving it proves impossible. As sleep approaches, carrying you from conscious thought into the mysterious realm of dreams, let these ideas settle into that deeper part of yourself where wisdom takes root. The questions Aristotle posed, the virtues he described, the vision of flourishing he articulated, these aren't merely theoretical constructs, but invitations to transformation. Tomorrow, when you wake, the same choice will face you that faces everyone every day. What kind of person will I become through my choices today? Will I move toward virtue or away from it? Will I exercise practical wisdom or act thoughtlessly? Will I engage in excellent activity or merely pass time? The Aristotelian path doesn't promise ease. It demands sustained effort, patient practice, honest self-examination, courage to change. But it promises something more valuable than ease, the possibility of living excellently, of developing genuine virtue, of achieving the kind of flourishing that makes life deeply meaningful. You are not doomed to remain as you are. Character can be reformed, though with difficulty. Practical wisdom can be cultivated, though it takes years. Virtue can be achieved, though it requires practice. Eudaimonia is possible, though it demands everything. The philosopher who taught the greatest conqueror, who founded the systematic study of virtue, who mapped the territory of human excellence with unprecedented precision, offers you the same challenge he offered young Alexander in that sunlit garden at Mieza. Choose to live well, develop your capacities, cultivate virtue, exercise practical wisdom, form genuine friendships, engage in contemplation, participate in community, make your life an expression of excellence. This is what it means to flourish as a human being. This is the path to eudaimonia. This is Aristotle's answer to the question of how we should live. And now, as the gentle rhythm of philosophy gives way to the gentle rhythm of sleep, as conscious thought dissolves into dreams, as the day's activities transform into night's rest, remember that even in sleep you participate in the natural rhythms Aristotle studied, the patterns that govern all embodied existence. Your body repairs itself while you rest, following principles Aristotle investigated in his biological works. Your mind processes experience, consolidating memories, preparing for tomorrow's choices. Your character continues its slow formation, shaped by today's decisions, ready to face tomorrow's opportunities for virtue or vice. Sleep well, knowing that the project of becoming excellent continues even in rest, that the possibility of eudaimonia awaits tomorrow, that Aristotle's wisdom remains available whenever you need it, that the question of how to live well is always worth asking. If you found value in this exploration of ancient wisdom, if Aristotle's vision of human flourishing speaks to your own yearning for a meaningful life, please consider subscribing and liking to support this channel. Your presence here helps these ideas reach others who seek to live excellently. Thank you for spending this time exploring the philosophy that has guided humanity's noblest aspirations for 23 centuries. Sweet dreams, fellow traveller, on the path toward virtue. May you wake tomorrow ready to continue the endless, worthwhile work of becoming who you're capable of being. The journey toward eudaimonia continues with your next choice, your next action, your next opportunity to exercise excellent rational activity. Aristotle believed we are made for flourishing. Tonight, as you rest, trust that this is true, and tomorrow, through your choices, prove it.